I will give a minute of context for how we've all arrived at this moment, and then I will launch into this talk. So, for about a year, I did batch in fall 22, and I got really curious about the deep learning kind of wave, and in particular, imagery, image models, being able to generate imagery. That seemed really interesting. I had a hunch there was something there with image and therapeutic work, be it body work or psychedelics or therapy, is just a huge part of my life. So I thought there was something there. Wrote up a sketch of a talk for Strange Loop, not really knowing what the talk was, as one does, just kind of bullshitting. And it was like, oh, imagery and therapy, there's something there. Then they accepted the talk, and I was like, oh, okay, what do I do with that? And so this will tell the story of playing with these models in a practice group, and then basically doing a couple of weeks of giving a lot of sessions and then telling those stories. And I got super sick in September and I couldn't go to Strange Loop. I didn't know what was going on. It was very weird, very weird. Just lots of weird, inconsistent symptoms. It turned out it was a cancer diagnosis, which I didn't know at the time. And so for about 6 months, this project's been kind of clawing at the back of my brain, like, you bake the cake, now serve the cake. You bake the cake, now serve the cake. And I reached out to Nicole, I don't know, probably a few months ago. And I was like, Nicole, help me make it happen. She was like, yes, I'll do it. And then several times I would just kind of space out or, whatnot. So this is exciting to me to have enough energy to be like, I'm going to speak for 20 to 30 minutes. I think it's going to make sense. I think we're going to talk about it afterwards. I trust the me who wrote these things to just kind of read these slides and have them be interesting. We'll find out if they are. So anyhow, that's just how we're here. Is that's hence it's the last Strange Loop talk of it was supposed to be at Strange Loop. Now it's now. That was the last Strange Loop. This is definitely the last talk. This is definitely the latest in the program. So just how we got here. Um, I retitled this talk "Hanging Out with Imagery," and I found in trimming it down, I really wanted to get to these kind of core questions of art therapy and imagery and therapy has a long tradition. And a lot of people know it from Jungian therapy and archetypes. And the first version of this talk cared a lot more about like situating this as part of the body of work of art therapy and whatnot. And what I found when I really thought about like why give this talk is actually there were a couple of sessions I thought went really well. I thought the imagery made it a lot easier for me as practitioner and receiver as client just to be on the same team. And I just think it's interesting to get exposed to someone's thoughts about good therapy as one searches for support for oneself. What does it feel like? How do you have a watermark for it? And so really, I just want to play with, here's 3 sessions. I thought they went well. I thought the image models really helped. This is what that's about. And then we talk about it afterwards. So the idea of a generative image session, it concretely came up. I was in a therapy and coaching practice group. I study a body of work called organic intelligence, which is one of many systems that focuses on somatic body-based psychology. And they have a notion that imagery matters as much as thinking or emotion or body sensation. They really prize imagery as like a first-class citizen in that world of it matters, it's interesting. And they both mean the imagery that might be dreams, it might be kind of classical image content, but it also might just be the metaphors we use when we're talking, the things that we unconsciously will use a metaphor or an image and just what's in that. So I was in a practice group. I was playing with image models a lot, largely in the Recurse Center context. And I just thought something's here. Let's try giving each other a session and making an image at some point in the session. And this was an image from a session I got. I had every year when it's my dad's death anniversary, I try to do a psychedelic trip. I had just done one. And there were a couple of moments where I noticed a positive feedback loop in my attention. One was looking at moss, and the more I looked, the more complex it got. One was a friend playing piano, and the same thing. Like the more I listened, the more interesting it got. And at the time, I was thinking a lot about where is attention going? And there's kind of all of the difficult things happening with attention in the internet. I just thought, oh, interesting. These are positive feedback loops. I feel rewarded for my attention. So was getting a session. I was the practice client. And my friend was like, let's just make an image of music and moss together. And one of the fun things about these sessions is people will approach them with a couple words, with huge sentences. There's that naivete to how does the toy work? How does it make an image? What matters, what doesn't? So they just threw a few words in. I got back this photo, and it just was this nice little stamp where I could remember the experience of my attention getting rewarded musically and visually by looking at that photo. And it was just like it was like an access point. It was like a pointer of, oh, okay, now I've got this positive experience and I can stretch it out a bit. I can learn from it. I can like simmer in it a bit longer. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. So I decided that I was going to do a batch of sessions. It ended up being about 15 over 2 weeks. Um, Using Stable Diffusion XL, using the very generic Dream Booth interface, just type some words, get a picture, nothing complex, nothing modified. Um, I sent out an email to a community I'm part of, and I was like, hey, if you want a free coaching session, I'm going to do this little research project. I'm going to record this session just for my own like memory, my own documentation. I'm going to delete it afterwards. I might give a talk about like your session, but do you want to try this thing? Um, One thing that's just worth noting is one of the conversations I had when I was doing this work, someone was like, how are people letting you record therapy sessions? Like what? That doesn't make any sense. What's going on there? And I was like, well, I don't know. I don't know. We're drawing stuff. We're talking about it. I'm going to delete it afterwards. It's just for me to remember what happened in the session. And as we got talking, what came out was this way of working, organic intelligence's way of working is a positive reinforcement framework. So meaning something good, comforting, interesting, engaging happens, that's where you tend to focus your attention. It's an opposite model from a digging model. So it's not a Tharsis model. It's not a like, let's go to the root of what's difficult. It's more of a, oh, you mentioned something that was meaningful to you there. Let's not miss that. Let's hang out for a bit. Let's see what else comes up when we hang out there. And from a researchy kind of point of view, this is really nice because it means that I'm not asking people to disclose something and record it. You tend to kind of feel like you're on the same side of the couch as the client, like you are with them, you're allied with them, you're looking at their experience, or in this case, you're looking at their imagery, but it's less confronting, it's less adversarial, and it flowed well with like people are really happy to receive that kind of work. And I think there's less of a barrier to, oh, you want to talk about that? Sure. I'm happy for you to tell a story about things I love. That's totally fine. So the structure of this talk, real simple. There's 3 sessions. One's about frogs. One's about a vocal coach and them visualizing a performer. And the last one I think is maybe the most meaningful to me of these 3, which is a friend of mine was going through a grief process. We did a session, and I felt like there was a lot of richness there. So those 3 sessions we'll just talk about. There'll be a brief interlude in between 1 and 2. We're just going to go through the stories of those. So first session, so I sent out this email and I'd sort of encourage people like, notice your imagery for the week beforehand, notice your dreams, notice recurring imagery. And then, like any project, you're quickly aware that when someone gets in the room, like half the people read the note, half the people didn't, and you're like, okay, I will roll with whatever comes my way. Sure, there was a request, notice imagery. And that for me was about wanting to make sure there was a starting point somewhere. People tend to use imagery as they describe their world, but I wanted the best chance of like, let's visualize something with real meaning rather than visualizing for the sake of it or feeling like we're trying to use this tool, but it's kind of like this awkward observer of an actual interaction. So this client came in, it's not someone I knew very well, and they were like, frogs, I want to talk about frogs. And really there was no context. It was just like, I want happy frogs. I want to look at happy frogs. And I was like, okay, we will roll with this. Great. Um, Trusting that there's somewhere in the associative networks that come off of, is it animals? Is it nature? Is it amphibians? Somewhere in that associative network, there's a reason why we're talking about this. There's sort of a trust, like this feels really random at first. And I think it seemed random to the client. It seemed like I have this image, we're going to start here. And there's some nonlinear path we need to take to find out, like, oh, that's why it came up. But for now, we're just going to trust it and also treat it like dream content. I feel like dream content has incredible significance, but also things can just happen and you can just shrug it off and be like, okay, why am I in my childhood home? I just am. Not a big deal. So they came in, visualized some frogs, put it in the style of watercolors. And we're talking, and more nature imagery is coming in. There's horses. The client shares that they take care of horses. They've got a relationship with horses. There's deer. Client shares that they live in a fairly rural setting. So there's just a lot of room for animals to come in and stream through, and that interaction is happening. And maybe at this point in the session, it felt very companionable to me as practitioner. Like, okay, we're talking, I'm getting to know you. This is someone I haven't worked with before. This is interesting. And again, there's kind of that faith holding of like, this is taking us somewhere. We're getting deeper into this network. It was frogs, now it's horses and deer and frogs. Um, I also was just curious to note, for the most part, the AI glitches didn't distract that much, which was one of my curious questions. Like for example, this fine frog here seems to have maybe the horse's legs or deer's legs. Something anatomically is funny there. And for the most part, I won't say 100% of the time, but for the most part, it didn't get in the way of actually having a session. Because that was one of my concerns is like, is the weird limit going to get crossed here at some point? And we're just too distracted by like something strange is appearing. Generally didn't happen. And of course, like, there were times when someone would explain to me, like, oh, the reason why that image looks weird is because anatomically this animal has this. And, people who really know the content will see the discrepancies more than I will at first. And so I just, that was a thing to navigate, but it wasn't a deal breaker. That was one of my curiosities in doing these sessions. So the last kind of beat of this session, we stayed on this animal theme. About 40 minutes in, the client has a rush of emotion, face goes kind of red, tears come up, and they share what's been so moving about spending time with these animals, which all have a fair bit of spring, vitality, bounce in their movement, was that the client had their own set of chronic health challenges. And so there's something actually very sincere and sweet about just being with animals that felt, that moved, that emoted. There's something about that because of their own sense of loss of not be always being able to have access to the level of energy they wanted to. And for me, there were two things that were really striking. One is I just didn't know this about this client. This was wholly new to me. And it was that sense of, I don't know if it always happens, but it's great when you can trust a free association to bring you to the right thing. And it also felt like the timing was right. I didn't feel like you can sometimes feel when you're deep in with someone, okay, that next thing said was a new thing, or that next thing said was actually a bit too much, and it's a bit awkward, and it's a bit of a stretch, and maybe they're forcing themselves to be vulnerable, but actually they're in a state of like, I should disclose now. It's what you do if you're a good client. Versus this just it was just the next step. It was just we've been talking about the positive side of this, of animals with spring and vitality. And then here's the compliment, which is, oh, it's precious when you lose good health. And then you see it and it means more to you than just something random. There's something specific about, oh yeah, I yearn for that. I love being around it. It's good for me to take care of horses. It's good to simmer in that. The last thing, and this is just more a comment about how these sessions went as a whole, was I didn't know that's where we were going to go with the client. I didn't know that there was a chronic health challenge, but I trusted that they were engaged. That was the main signal I was trusting. I don't know that every free association is productive, but there was that sense of engagement. They were engaged, and I was like, okay, I'm going to trust that. Like, this is interesting to you. I don't know where it's going. I don't know why we're drawing animals. I'm going to trust that. I'm going to trust that like there's something here that will become clear to both of us. And it felt like it was that relationship of, oh, vitality is really precious, especially when you don't have access to it the way you want to. And that's sort of what came up. And it came up really naturally. And it came up in a way where it wasn't the starting point of the session and maybe couldn't have been, or maybe would have been forced. So that's the first session. That one felt good and solid to me. This is a little sidebar, which is in a different session. I was just wondering at some point, I was like, why make synthetic imagery? We have Google image search. And a lot of what I can say is nice about this approach is you're not in words the whole time with someone. And so you can gesture at things that are like half conscious or not quite verbal. Like, I know this picture means something to me. You don't have to fully explain it. You can just know this picture means something. And I just thought, well, if part of what's good is just having an image and like sticking it to the metaphorical pinboard, well, you could use real images. Like, why aren't we using real images? And so somebody had an image of switchbacks up a mountain and, went to Google image search, found a great photo. But then I had this hunch. It didn't really take. It didn't really take. This was like, I think this moment probably felt to the client like Michael's over there twiddling with knobs for 2 minutes and he showed me this thing and we're going to get back to the real thing in a second. But like, why are we at Google image search? Like, I don't mind, but like, what's the deal? Why are we here? And I think this is a guess. I didn't check in with the client, but I guess that it's because this picture isn't just this picture. It's this picture in this location, in this story, with this meaning, with this very, very, this is what this picture means. And it occurred to me this interesting quirk with generative imagery is it's kind of free floating. It's associative. It associates to lots of other pictures, but it's being made for you. There's no specific that is that trail on this mountain and it's really hard and there's this famous story about the hiker. There's none of that. It's just here you go. Here are switchbacks without any context, without any association. And it felt to me like the psyche can like assimilate that better. You can just grab the image and be like, oh, I know what the switchbacks mean. I know what the moss means. I know what the forest means. And there isn't this sense of like a history behind it, which I think for the psyche is really useful to grab an image. So that's a hypothesis I'd love to check out more, but it just struck me as a unique kind of work that goes really well of using an image without prior history that is kind of free floating in the ether. I think the psyche can use that really well to say, great, I'm going to tell you what that means now. There's no meaning that I'm getting in the way of. So the second session I gave was to someone who's a vocal coach. They work with a lot of performers. Their base is in vocal coaching. And they had come in just having built a website. So they were really full of like aesthetic opinion, aesthetic energy. I think they'd work with a designer. So they had like images to show me of like, this is what I gave the designer. This is what we got. There was a lot of reds, pinks, blues, purples, magentas, a very clear color palette. And so it felt like we can just go from there. Let's take that visual aesthetic. Let's start generating imagery in that direction, and let's just see where that takes us. So we start with them wanting to visualize the performer who's performing in a really radiant way. We start there. Um, and we must generate something like this like 8 different times. This is clearly the focus is the performer. I think we go through like 25 images. But what was really interesting about this session was this was from the second batch. I think it was 3 images at a time, 8 iterations. This was from the second, and the client just kept coming back to like, oh, that's the image. That's the image. We would generate more, and they'd be like, yeah, these other ones, they're not as good. This is the image. And there were two things that stood out to the client. One was there's this kind of like glow, aura, magnetic light thing happening around them. And that was really interesting to the client. They said that what they were really trying to get at with vocal coaching is this kind of high charisma, high magnetic state where you can be in the audience and you can feel like, oh, the performer's talking directly to you. And like something happens where a performer is able to talk to each individual, even though there's hundreds or thousands of people in that audience, there's some kind of, when a performer is really charismatic, you feel like, oh, they're speaking to me, they're singing to me. And that's really what this vocal coach wanted to get across in their work. And there was something about the radiance, the way that the performer was lit up. They're like, oh, that's what I want to get at. It's this lit up state, it's this quality of being. And again, that hadn't been in our conversation until this performer happened to be lit up. I was struck by it because it also to me feels like a visual artifact. There wasn't anything that we asked for. We're like, oh, this performer should look well lit or radiant or glowing. Um, that wasn't the thing we asked for. And like I said, we generated, I think 18 more images after this, and all of them were like, no, let's go back to that one. Let's go back to that one. None of those are as interesting because they're missing this quality of someone glowing from the inside out. And it hadn't been something to name. It hadn't been something I was tracking of like, oh, this is an important quality we need to get right. It just showed up. It just showed up, and the client was like, yeah, that's it. And that was an interesting moment for me of like, okay, to a point, there's a usefulness to the randomness, glitchiness, strangeness. To a point, if we're not getting too off base, there's something useful about that variation that someone can grab and say, oh, I forgot to tell you, I think of vocal coaching as empowering someone in a kind of magnetic, charismatic, spiritual way. I forgot about that, but I see it. Now I can speak to it. The other piece of this one that was interesting was there's something that the client took to be the moon kind of up here. And that triggered a whole memory of when they were developing the vocal coaching work, sitting, feeling bathed by light, that image again, by the moon, feeling like the moon was deeply non-judgmental. And just this whole memory came out of the free associations like, oh, the moon's there. And again, that wasn't something that was on the menu, so to speak. It wasn't something I had access to. It wasn't something I was going to ask about. But somehow the client saw the moon and was like, oh, right, I've had this important memory about developing this work and feeling like being bathed in light was one of the most non-judgmental experiences. So that was just interesting. Again, another feels like a glitch. We didn't ask for a moon. The moon was really useful. So yeah, just that sense that these glitches, artifacts, unexpected associations can become chances for discovery. And I'd put the asterisk on that as long as we're not too far off base, as long as we're still in, I can recognize the core idea of that's a performer performing, the aesthetic looks right. Then these kind of extra things can pop off interesting side memories, interesting tangents, which give more texture. I do think if the image gets too far off base, if you lose that continuity, it does distract someone. But in this case, it just added quite a bit. So the last little vignette I've got, um, in a way, this was the session that moved me the most from this batch. I was really happy when I got to share about it, when the friend of mine who was the client in this case was okay with that. Um, I wasn't sure because they were actively in a grief process. They had been caring for their parent, for their father for quite a while. Father had just passed. They signed up for one of these sessions, and actually, I was very ready to just like jettison the project. I was just like, the thing that's important is you're in a real process here. Like, I have this tool, whatever. I have no need to like make you diffuse things. And I have no idea if this is going to actually feel in line with like where you're at, the actual like the rubber's meeting the road in your life. Sure, I've got this project, like whatever, not a big deal. So the first half of the session, it's about an hour, so 30 minutes, was really just, exploring the contours of the grief process and what's happened and just verbal talk session. And then to my surprise, halfway through, they volunteered. They're like, oh, you know what? I want to try that image thing. I want to try it. And I was surprised. By that point, I had just kind of been like, okay, like we're not doing this today. It's fine. Um, they had been an art therapist before they were retired. So I think there was an interest in like, okay, what is this? What is this iteration of art therapy like? Um, and I think they maybe also just felt like they got me up to date. They felt complete sharing verbally. They want to try this experiment. And when they were sharing, they had mentioned that gardening was particularly supportive as they were grieving. And so I thought, great, let's start there. Let's draw a garden. Let's see where that goes. So lush green garden, draw that. First thing they notice right away is, oh, there's a path. We didn't ask for a path, but that interests the client. But the path, not very appealing. It's kind of jagged. It's not like a nice path. So that was the first thing they zeroed in on right away. Was okay, let's make that path nicer. And just by naming it, it clears up, it gets more appealing, it looks more natural. Um, and kind of what happens, and we stay here for the next 30 minutes. This is the rest of our session. It's just iterating and iterating and iterating on this image. And details keep popping out at the client. There keeps being a next step or a yes and, like, I like this, but in this case now the path is closed. You're walking and you run into some bushes. And the client notices that and is like, no, the path's not closed. The path is like, it should open up. It should take you somewhere. And from my point of view, part of what fascinated me was the client knew what these things should look like. Like the client knew, oh, the path isn't quite nice. Oh, this isn't open. Um, they mentioned that they wanted something beautiful to be on the path. Like there's a reason to walk down the path. So we added flowers. I'm like, okay, there should be something that draws your eye, draws your interest along it. It shouldn't just be a path for the sake of it. And I was really struck by a couple of things. This is a little debatable, but I think it's unusual when someone gets to really burrow into themselves and really refine a thought or a feeling or an image. I think it's unusual unless someone is writing on a page for somebody to refine their language for like 30 minutes and really say, okay, there's something about a garden, but I really want to get the detail right. Um, and so it really struck me that there was a very natural, alive engagement, and it felt like there was like a ping-ponging of image, client's inner sense, image, and that each time the client either got clearer or more articulate about, oh, it wants to feel spacious, it wants to feel open. It's like the image naturally developed every time they got a ping back, and they're like, oh, okay, I feel resonance. That has meaning. We're not quite there yet. I was really struck by that. I was struck by, I don't think people tend to do that with their sentences. And I can think of counterexamples, but I think it's rare to be able to settle into something and say, I really want to get this expression right with somebody else. The kind of flip side of this was I also felt grateful to not put this into words too soon. It reminded me of, I think, a really common experience in therapy, coaching, all of it is you put words to something before you have the right words. And it just feels like a clunker every time. Someone's asked you how you feel, and you've given them a word like, oh, I'm anxious, but you're not sure if it's really, is it anxious? Is it physical body stuff? Is it what exactly? And the conversation starts to go in that direction. Oh, tell me about your anxiety. And there's this like kind of clunker feeling like, I'm not sure that's actually what I'm experiencing. You asked me a question in words, I had to give you a word back. And it felt like a privilege to be able to give my friend in this case 30 minutes in imagery. I could have made up words. There are many plausible words for what this is about. Post grief, the path forward, the next chapter, but they all feel a little saccharine. They all feel a little Hallmark cardy, and they all feel like when someone's trying to end things on a nice final note, but there actually isn't a final note yet, that actually the client's unconscious is just splaying out and getting explored. And this might be really meaningful to them. It may or may not. The image may develop, and that might be, wow, that's something that I need to apprehend or get to know better. Maybe this was just for this half an hour. This was the dream, and the dream is going to be like a bubble bursting in a second. And it was just nice to be in that dream with a friend. And I flip to the next image here. Yeah, this is where it opens up. This is where the image opens up. There was a really sweet moment where there was a kind of consistent engagement with this as a medium, as an art form, just playing with it. And there's a really sweet moment where maybe 20 minutes into this kind of half hour, they pop up, they look at me and they say, you know, my mood is lighter than when we started. And it sort of felt like someone, you know, they've been obsessively writing or drawing or writing or drawing, and they pop up and make eye contact for 10 seconds, and then they want to go back in. And what I took from that is even a moment of respite in something as big, messy, long as grief, you know, just every drop in the ocean, I think helps. And I think big, long, complex states like that, they can just kind of go on and on. And I've had the experience of feeling very lost in experiences like that. And just having a clear, even if it's just a moment, even if that moment lasts 15 seconds and then it evaporates, I think there's something about, oh, all right, I felt better for at least 15 seconds here. That's a reminder that that's possible for me. That's helpful. And I felt something like that in that moment of just this kind of pop up, the spontaneous, oh, this is makes me feel lighter. I don't know how long that endured. Grief is so complex and messy. You know, it may have been a minute. It may have been not that long, but just even a moment, I think, okay, we're on the right track here. We're reminding the body and the physiology. Okay, you know, there is a way to feel that is comfortable, despite probably everything being just, you know, tremendously uncomfortable. And the last one in this set, um, just the last image, you know, we've got the path, we've got the beautiful flowers, we've got the sky. The last thing we were playing with was time of day, morning, just, you know, what impact does lighting have on this picture? And somehow it just sort of, you know, it makes there's blooming flowers. Now this tree is blooming, you know, somehow the blooming has kind of taken center stage, which I think is what the client wanted of color as a way to pull them through it. And just, you know, a reiteration of that point, it's nice to not have to force people into words. You know, both as client, both as practitioner, it's really nice to be able to have a meaningful exchange and just stick in imagery. Something I heard a lot of people say when they did these sessions, which surprised me, I hadn't expected, was this was helpful because they could get specific, but they wouldn't have been comfortable drawing. That for a number of folks, there's something intimidating about I'd like to draw my dream or my image for you, but I'm frustrated by my lack of dexterity, and that's going to totally distract me from like actually engaging. And for a number of folks, it felt like a really useful scaffold to say, great, these images look close enough and they don't distract me. They're in the right ballpark, and then we can engage with them. I think the big thing I got out of these sessions was when there's a helpful state that's not fully conscious, you could call it pre-verbal, you could call it semi-conscious, but there's enough recognition of it to see an image and say, yeah, that's close. That image is close. I want to get that image right now, but that means something to me. It's like a whole conversation, but it doesn't require someone to yet be so formed and so clear that they've got the words for it. And so in that last session in particular, like we hung out with those images for half an hour, and it felt to me like, oh, this is great. Like I'm not forcing this person to write a Hallmark card about their grief. We can just stay here and we can just be in this state together. So those are the sessions. I appreciate very much everyone's attention and listening, and it just feels nice to be in the Recurse community to share this out with all of you. So thank you. I'm gonna call the talk done at the announcement of this cat who loves you, which is me. I haven't looked at the chat at all. I don't know if folks have questions or comments or curiosities, but I am going to stop sharing for now. Obviously, I can pull that back up easily just so I can see folks. But yeah, I wonder, yeah, are there questions, comments, reactions?
I got a question.
Sure.
I mean, first off, that was super fascinating, and I feel like
Yeah.
even it just seems like such a cool way to take advantage of the like random nature of it. and have it be specific enough but random enough. It's like there's so few things that we get that have that balance.
Yeah.
Um, so that was really cool. I was curious a bit more about the actual process, like during the session.
Ah,
Like, do you like are they seeing you type on the screen? Are you like turning away and then like bringing it back to them? Like, because I feel like that makes a big difference. Like, especially the UI of these things be pretty cluttered, and then like, what's that like for you and for them?
yeah, the choice I made for these was I would share my screen. I was using a web UI, and the web UI was very like type words here, pictures here. And it really hid 95% of the functionality of an image model.
Mm,
it was just, words, pictures. I would sometimes prompt folks about style because that to me just feels like a hidden quirk of like, by the way, you can you could suggest a particular style that's resonant for you and it will do a good job of going with you. That just feels like a fact that one needs to play with these things. But for the most part, I was driving. I tried to stick as close verbatim as possible to the wording of the client, or if they wanted to dictate, I would happily let them. But I was also a bit concerned about we had an hour. I made a choice to do a lot of one-off sessions rather than like find five people and do like five sessions in a row with them. I made that choice. And so I just worried about the kind of tripping over technology. What's this thing? I also felt, I consciously used language when announcing this of like, it's about generative imagery. And I was steering away from AI of just like, yeah, like it's not the thing of the New York Times that might kill you. It's just like it makes pictures. Like, let's make pictures together. And I was just worried about like tripping all of those. Like, I don't want that to come into the session or take over or
mm,
so I was driving very simple web UI. Um, and so as much as I could sticking to the clients, like their words, their expression, and occasionally prompting for like, by the way, style's the thing it can do. And like you won't know that. So like let me just give you that fact.
mm. That's great. Makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Yeah. I'm gonna call on hands raised. I'm gonna call on the order they're raised in and assume that's the right order. So hi Lee.
Hello.
Hi.
I thoroughly enjoyed the chat, and
Hi.
there were two things: a comment, something that I don't know that I captured exactly the way you said it. The recording will see. You said something about to a point the variation can be useful, and I just wanted to say with my own experimentation and playing around with all of the Stable Diffusion stuff locally as well as all the online ones, I enjoy that discovery process, and I enjoy that surprise of what is going to come out of it, and I thoroughly enjoy that. And so I think I had not considered, like, I find it entertaining, I guess would say. It's almost like a new form of television to just sit here and like, what can this thing make? And it's
Mhm.
nice though because it is more interactive. And so, not tangentially related to that, the big thing that stood out in my head while you were talking, had you considered that any of this is potentially adjacent to the Rorschach type, is that how you say it? Rorschach type testing, where it's kind of like the inverse.
Mhm.
So you're like, what are you projecting onto it? What are you perceiving from it? And then
Mhm.
that's where I was kind of open ended, like what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, no, definitely. Um, in the prior version of this talk where I wasn't consciously conserving energy and I was going to connect it to the tradition of imagery and therapy and had quotes and things. And it was more intellectual fancy town, but also I think it was me trying to perform being a smart person. And there's something about being ill where you're just like, that's what I'm trying to say. That's what I have energy for. Great. That's what we're doing. I don't need to be intellectual fancy town about this. But I thought a lot about that kind of question of like my understanding, I don't know Rorschach tests well, but my understanding is like they're a projective surface, right? It's for your subconscious to project onto and then to go with that. And I feel like they get famously used in comics of like the therapist forcing a projection where the person's like, I don't see anything. I feel like they like come up a lot in comics. Um, and I think that what I will say is that the features that felt projective almost always felt secondary. Like there's something about, I mean, one of the discussions that like, you know, Eric and I've had for quite a while is like, are the better models less creative? Like less good as a creative partner? The better a model gets at imitating human language? Does that make it a worse creative partner because you get this thing and it's correct, it's what you asked for in terms of language or image, but there's not room for like seeing a nonlinear thing? And so I felt like when the projective piece happened, it was usually a secondary characteristic. Like, because often the figure and the ground were like matched what the person thought or were close enough, but it was like in the Grief and Gardens example, it kept being things like, oh no, the path should be nice. Oh, there should be flowers along it. Oh, it should be open. But that it was a garden never really came. It was a garden. It was a garden that worked. But all these secondary characteristics, I took that as this person really would like, after going through a hard thing, an experience of openness, of being drawn forward, of it being easy, of being motivated by beauty. I took that as this is this person saying, like, this is what I need for myself. But it was all in the secondary characteristics of the image. It wasn't in the garden. It was in the lighting or the path or how far it goes. And I sort of feel like that's a function of like how good image models are, which is like where they make mistakes is where you can project. But when they draw the thing and you think it's what you wanted, I feel like it's hard to project onto that. It's just like, oh yeah, I wanted a dragon, it's a dragon. Okay, sure. Erica, I call it Erica.
Hey,
Hi.
so that was great. And I had offered to share a little bit about my experience.
Yeah.
I did one of these sessions, and it was really, really awesome. And it like changed my attitude towards therapy. And because I've been doing this active imagination image work on my own for a long time. I keep an active imagination journal. I'm really sort of inspired by Jungians, but I never managed to find a Jungian therapist. And so what we did was we went through some imagery that's just been in my head for a long time. But I'm not an artist, and like Michael was saying, like I am one of those people who I just can't satisfyingly get what I'm thinking of on a page. So yeah, it was really interesting to see the images that were in my head sort of come up, and I think it kind of like, I don't know, it kind of changed what the images are to me a little bit. And it was really incredibly helpful to just have someone listen to me talk about my silly images for a while. And so that was great. And I got a different therapist because like that was great and therapy wasn't great. So clearly something had to change. And I'm still looking for like more ways to engage with imaginal work. And I did this depth psychology course. So it's continued to be a really important part of my life, but it really sort of catalyzed seeing it as like something real, right? Not just like my own little, I'm off in my own little world doing imaginal work, but I know it's not a real thing or whatever, but into something that's more part of things.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing all that. And it sort of loops me back to the beginning intention of, I think there's this really interesting and complex question, which is I often think of good support as like leaving a psychological watermark, like the way that the waves come in and leave a watermark and then go back out in the tide of just like, oh, like once you've had support that feels really interesting or comfy or is a good fit, you kind of have that watermark, like, oh, that's what I'm looking for. But I think a real challenge in any support profession is when someone hasn't had that watermark, well, maybe this thing is working and I don't recognize it, or maybe it's not. I can't tell. There's no like internal compass. And, I a friend of mine was just taking care of me and they had gotten fired by their therapist and they were telling me about the story. And I was just like, that's a bad therapist. I feel, I have so little energy. I'm not gonna like sugarcoat this fact. Like that was just a bad therapist. Like they fired you because they couldn't handle you as a person. Bad therapist. And my friend had no sense of knowing, like, well, did I fuck up? I don't know. The therapist fired me. I don't know. And I just feel like there's a really interesting question of without that watermark, without that sense of like, oh, that felt comfy. Like, how does
Mhm.
one find that? I think is a really interesting question and makes me interested in talking about support and talking about what works and what doesn't and why, because I think it's one way to peripherally get at that. Like, oh, okay, that sounds appealing. I'd like something like that if I actually approached a professional. That's the thing I know to ask for now. So I really liked hearing what came of that session.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll call on Josh Horowitz. Hi, Josh Horowitz.
Hi, Nagel.
Yeah.
That was great. That was really lovely to hear. It feels really meaningful to hear just these really specific stories of these experiences of these people. It's a really precious thing to hear. So I appreciate you sharing all that.
Yeah.
My question is maybe a little bit nerdy, but it was really interesting to me when you were saying that it was valuable to stay in like a sort of a non-verbal space where you don't have to put things into words. Because it occurs to me that, I mean, you are putting things into words, and that I guess maybe you're making prompts, but they're talking to you, and you're all using words. So I I can sort of imagine there being maybe multiple axes here, because when you give the contrast to putting things into words, it's kind of these like summative, like oh, I guess I'm, trying to like summarize or contain everything instead of an imaginative space of words. So I can kind of imagine two axes of like, maybe you could do like an imaginative poetry thing that would be verbal but not require that kind of closing off. But that's my take. I wonder, is there something that's like really fundamentally like the use of imagery really is essential here, and like poetry wouldn't work in the same way?
Yeah. So yeah, I have two thoughts there. I think I'm appreciating your question, and I think a better descriptor might have been the work in those sessions was to like bridge or connect imagery and thinking, imagery and meaning, that it's sort of like you're making a connection between these two channels. Because of course, we're talking, we're coming up with little keywords, we're putting them in, we're talking about what we're getting. It's not like I hold up a whiteboard, they hold up a whiteboard, there's Stable Diffusion hanging out, There's still verbalization, clearly. And so I think a better descriptor might be like, is it bringing those two into balance, or is it bridging those two? There's a whole body of work, which isn't what these sessions explored, called focusing, which is a lot about putting words to the felt sense of the body. And I think why approaches like that are successful is something gets located. I say pre-verbal, it's not the right term because that's like before words, and I just mean like not words, averbal, maybe. Where often people have this sense of like, oh, that is the felt sense of that's important, that's meaningful, this is exciting, or like I'm on the cusp of something new, like as I articulate this. And my sense is that seems to come from body feeling or an interesting image. And somehow pairing that with words gives it a bit of a grip of like, oh, now I could tell someone, now I can think about that, now I can write about it, now I can explore that. But yeah, I think a better description is trying to like match image to words. And I think like one of the central questions that any coach or therapeutic practitioner has is like, where's the juice? Where's the meaning in the session? Where is the thing that isn't just you're talking and the client's listening to you, but you're both a little bit bored and maybe the client's a little bit uncomfortable. And like I used to have this thing when folks would tell me about their therapy experiences and I'd ask how it's going. They'd be like, I think it's helping. I'd be like, I want the world where it's like, it's helping. It's not like I'm doing this thing because I read a listicle and it's a good thing to do, but like I actually don't feel any different in my day-to-day experience versus like I took a huge inhale and I breathed easier, or I finally had the hard conversation. Whatever change comes where it's like it's unmistakable. And so I think maybe bridging is a better language. To your other question, so one of the places imagery comes up, I haven't seen this a ton, is so you can think about the polyvagal system of, we're oriented and we're connected. And if we're threatened, we fall into fight or flight. And then if we're threatened, we fall into freeze. And there's kind of this claim that the vagus nerve potentiates these evolutionary strategies and that it's a fallback pattern. It's a claim that it's a fallback pattern, that you go from I'm part of my group. I'm safe to like, okay, all the blood's gonna mobilize to my appendages so I can run or I can hit something, to we're just gonna play dead and everything's gonna turn off for a while. So there's a claim that in freezy states, oftentimes questions will like just bounce off someone, like, how did it feel in your body? And someone's like, I can't tell you how it felt in my body. Or what were you feeling? I don't know. What were you thinking? I don't know. But that imagery still runs in that state. And so there's an interesting claim that like there's like kind of a pathway into these more frozen places, which is image, and that imagery might be really abstract. You know, it might not be about a particular moment or event. It might be like, I saw a bunch of crystals and they are these colors and they're spinning at different rates. And you can start to play with that in a really abstract way. Is that about motion? Is that about everything feels gray? Um, but that's a kind of more clinical theoretical claim. I haven't seen that a ton personally. It's like I believe that claim, but I haven't run into too many situations where like imagery is the only channel. I take that back. I had um I worked with a client once who came in for a touch therapy session, but then let me know that they couldn't be touched in the session. And I had this moment of like, well, this is an interesting challenge because here we are, and this time is booked. And okay, we were roll with that. And we ended up working in imagery for quite a while. And that felt safe and that felt comfy. And I felt very, very grateful to have had this clinical fact to like clutch out and be like, let's try this. Because at the moment I was just a bit like, well, this is an awkward healing arts, memento right here of I don't know how to do the thing that I offered and you said you wanted to do without touching. It's body work, it's what we do. And then imagery turned out to be a really, really, it was available in that moment and it felt safe and it didn't feel overwhelming. So yeah, that's a long answer, but I liked your questions. Hi, Nicole.
Hi, so I have a question from someone in the audience.
Ah.
This person said, I'm wondering if you thought about this as a way of having a deeper conversation with someone who isn't very verbal, maybe interested in giving concrete cues and reacting with facial expressions. Would you have any advice or cautions for trying that?
Yeah, one of the sessions I gave, the feedback I got was like, I'm just actually not very comfortable verbally. I'm a lot more comfortable with imagery. It was like relieving to not have to talk for 55 minutes, but just like we can make pictures was like relieving. And that was the only feedback of that quality I got of like, it was almost like there was like an accessibility or an adaptive quality of like, oh, we can have a meaningful conversation in images and like that can be the main thing. And like, I don't have to make words. The only precaution I would have, and this project was done like the bulk of the sessions were like July, August last year. So I don't have a sense for where image models are now. My great fear, which I did not hit, but I think it's only by luck in these sessions, was I'm going to work with someone who's a person of color and they're going to want to visualize their sister, and we're not going to get a person of color. Something like that happening. Felt like it just felt like a landmine waiting to go off, of like someone not from the dominant culture asks for a picture, gets back a picture of the dominant culture hybridized with like tech boy culture, and we're just going to be off somewhere like completely inappropriate, that like the person will feel challenged or triggered, and not in a particularly productive way, in a way that's like, I wanted to visualize my wife and I see an anime assassin. What gives? And that felt really, really possible to me. And I felt like I was always holding in my breath and visualizing people. Like there was always just a part of me that was just like, no whammies, no whammies, no whammies. Like I just give the person back something that's close so we can actually do the therapeutic work. And I found myself like, quite like, if I was gonna do this project a second round, I would somehow want to fine tune a model in some direction that attempts to like neutralize this. It became really loud in my brain, and I was aware that like I didn't run into that, but it was only by luck. It wasn't by like someone is deeply thinking about, how people feel when constantly faced with the dominant culture, like the representation of person, human, man, woman, non-binary person, that there's so much nuance that somebody would like to be reflected back. And an image model is not going to do it, particularly with people. And so that's just my one precaution. But yeah, the session I gave where somebody really mentioned it like an accessibility bonus of like, we didn't have to talk the whole time. Thank God. I don't like talking. It's hard. I was just like, oh, okay. That's great. That was an unexpected like bonus.
Great, thanks. So I know we had initially said an hour. I don't know how you're feeling, if you want to keep answering questions or if you want to wrap.
I feel like I have 20 to 30 minutes more energy in me. So I'm happy to like do questions till they naturally peter out. That sounds great. I'm surprised by having this much energy. I did not 10 minutes before this hour started. So this is all just very exciting to me that I get excited talking about these things, which is helpful to not just be in bed all day, which is, half of where I live. Erica.
Yeah, I just wanted to share my experience of something like that happening. So I did a session with ChatGPT after our session, and I wanted someone who looked like me and had the role I had. So I wanted overweight female computer programmer. They can do overweight computer programmer. They can do female computer programmer. They cannot do overweight female computer programmer. It just
Right.
doesn't work.
Well, yeah.
And I don't know. It's just like I didn't not expect that kind of thing to happen, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Every time, I don't know, someone would query for a person, there would just be this bracing in me of just like, okay, like I really wish the controls on this were more clear or even existed. I would just brace. I would just brace. It didn't go wrong, but I think that's because it was a small sample size. I just think it was inevitable that that was going to happen. That's how I felt. And yeah, I can remember the bracing a lot of just like, oh, you would like to see someone like your sister. Okay. Okay. Okay, image model. Like, I'd like you to behave. And there's also, I think, the like semantic, like who gets centered, you know, if you say a person, what comes out of that, just the like the implicit centering of gender, race, class, etc. Of like, oh, a person must mean this, it must mean this. And it's like that's also a different form of trigger for some folks of like, why do I have to specify my ethnicity, but that person doesn't, or gender, or like why is there an implicit thing? So yeah. It doesn't surprise me that you ran into that, but they still cringe a bit. It's like, yeah.
I think I'm the only raised hand, so I'm just jumping in.
Great.
Does it seem plausible or possible to like set that as a guardrail in a session to say like we won't make images of people, and then you could fine tune to that end?
What was really loud in my brain when I was doing these sessions was like, if there was a second iteration of this project, I should attempt a fine tuning of a model to like just make a first pass at something that feels less biased. I don't even know what that would be, but it just felt loud. Um, I didn't want Stable Diffusion to be like I think people had a track or clock, you know? I really wanted it to be like you get used to this thing and you get used to asking me for imagery, and I'm going to prompt you sometimes to get that going, but that it just feels like a reflex. Like, oh, hey, now it's time to have the thing drawn. Let's draw it. And I think like the most simple, least complicated, least you have to remember these rules, the more it can get assimilated. It's like, oh, it's time to draw a thing. And so I really want that to be like on the model or interfaces end of just like, okay, like what does someone need to just be like I feel comfortable with the imagery as representative or something I belong to or not alienating or not just, this is the dominant culture and you are other than that. I bet you don't have that reflection very much. Here it is in therapy session, just to like just steer clear of that. And it felt to me like one of those moments where I could just feel the challenges of models and bias so like viscerally. It wasn't abstract. It was just like, is it gonna punk my session? I don't know. I don't know. I'd really prefer it didn't, but it might because I don't think anyone's thought about this in a way that is coherent enough to like actually, actually know like I don't have to worry about this.
Makes sense. Wonderful talk, by the way. Also, thank you for
Ah,
sharing.
ah, I'm glad. Hey, Max.
Hey, would a version of the same sort of system that asked for clarification be better or worse? Like, if you said, draw me a person, and it said, well, there's a lot of people out there, like, describe the person more, before, like, it sort of knew what was underspecified or overspecified. Would that be useful because you could get it more clear, or would it be worse because then it's sort of like there's now a verbal part to this like nonverbal session?
I think my gut is like, I would love to try that. My gut is better, and wanting to try that. I think just for like the moment of like, even the technological interface, just taking a moment to be like, I get there's complexity here. Let me slow down a second rather than, you know, like, I don't know these days where the body of images comes from for image models, but you definitely feel like the Instagram knob is turned up, the 4chan knob is turned up, and I feel like it just defaults. It just defaults to these kind of places where you're like, yeah, that's maybe not the aesthetic for like, I don't know. I'd like to have a conversation about my sister. It's like I wouldn't necessarily be like, great, we should hybridize Instagram and 4chan and give you a picture. And if it's laborious, I'd much rather have the model sort of be tactful or respectful of like, I don't actually know what you mean. Like, I need to clarify a few things before I can give you a visual representation that I think's in the right ballpark. I feel like erring on the side of like, it's a little slow. It does kind of shift the balance a little bit, but I just feel like the flip side of like the model assumes and assumes badly, just to me feels a bit like you lose faith in the tool. You're just be like, oh, okay, that's for someone else. Got it. We don't talk about these things with, with this kind of weird, creepy model of the picture versus seeing it as like ideally as like a smart whiteboard or something, like it draws well on your behalf. That's what it's there for. It draws well for you. You have the picture. We can look at the picture together. It's not supposed to have a personality that's injecting into the session of like, oh, people, I know what you mean by people. I've seen people on 4chan. You want a 4chan person? It's not supposed to have a voice in the session. It's supposed to just be a good silent partner. So I think prompting to me feels like a really nice, natural, like, oh yeah, that just seems better. It seems better.
Are there any other things that you would want to see in a system like this, besides maybe the training data being different, or maybe a bit of how it maybe clarifies things? Other things that would have been like, if it only had this, it actually would be like this much better, and then but therefore like be better therapeutically.
I think like, in wanting it to feel to the client like you just have this magic drawing tool now and it's just there. I think like at some point, um, there was a drawing, I think it was like a spaceship in space, capsule in space. And the client was like, oh, the size is wrong on that. Like it's the right elements, but the size is wrong. And I remember having a moment of like, I don't know, is there an easy way to prompt for a different size or not? And I did some digging around, and the answer I got from folks I asked was like, not really. That was the answer I got at the time, was like, there isn't something as simple as like in the style of Picasso. Um, and I think just some kind of really clear, like these are the exposed surfaces of like there's style, there's content. Your first noun is going to matter a lot, and it's going to really shape where this thing goes. Like just some set of heuristics to give to someone and to have. Because I felt aware that like that size question, I remember just being like, oh, I don't know the answer to this. play with these things for a while. I don't know if this is just like a keyword away or not. And I think just having some sense of like the knobs are, you're going to get a good responsivity with style or with lighting cues. You're not with a list of, 3 adjectives or more, it's going to start dropping things. 3 nouns or more, it's going to start dropping things. Like, where are those parameters? That was something that I think I wanted, because I didn't want to be Wizard of Ozing it so much. I wanted to just give them the tool, but because it was an hour only, I sort of took the more Wizard of Oz, like, I'm just going to drive, and you're probably going to check out a little bit while I'm doing this, because you're not doing the thing. You're watching someone do the thing. It's less engaging.
It's funny you say the word drive. I guess in some sense it is a pairing session.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
I wonder if those were all the questions. What are you thinking, Nicole?
so that sounds like all the now, so I'm going to hit stop recording. You want to stop recording?